My parents kicked me out of the house during the pandemic, but they let my brother and his wife stay. However, when I bought myself a house, they tried to make me give it to my brother. To give you some background, I'm a single guy in my early 30s. I have a younger brother who's 29, and he's already got 4 kids. He had his first child at 22, followed by another a year later, then a third 2 years after that, and the most recent one was born just a couple of months ago. His wife, who ill call Karen, and I do not see eye to eye. She loves to get under my skin by acting superior, and then turning into a dramatic victim whenever I push back. She's a master at putting on a convincing act to gain sympathy from just about anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, even though they know exactly what she's like and choose to ignore it. She's quite attractive, I'll give her that, but she's so awful that I could never be interested in her. She also refuses to work, despite having a college degree, and relies entirely on my brother's income. My mom helps out with the kids all day, so their finances are solely dependent on my brother's earnings. This also means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house, and privacy is a real issue with everyone crammed into a 3-bedroom house built in the 1960s. Growing up, my brother was clearly the favorite. We're 3 years apart, but he developed a superiority complex because I was always severely punished if I ever fought back against his antics. It was obvious my parents cared more about him, as he got the lion's share of everything, unless someone pointed it out, which did happen occasionally. This led my parents to move us about 150 miles away from other family members to avoid scrutiny. My brother was physically abusive towards me on several occasions, relentlessly flirted with my first girlfriend until she broke up with me, and mocked any misfortune I had. My parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. The only time I got equal treatment was when my parents wanted to maintain appearances. I admit it was somewhat satisfying to see the look on their faces when they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and holidays because other people were around. When I turned 18, I moved out, and my parents couldn't have been happier since they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school when I left, but couch surfing was better than living with them. I had minimal contact with them after that. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but I really didn't care. From that point on, I only saw my parents and brother on holidays, just like the rest of the family. When the pandemic hit in 2020, it wasn't kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job, and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment. I ended up selling nearly all of my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize drastically. I should have rented a cheaper place, but I liked living the high life until reality hit me. I realized I should have saved more money for a rainy day. I owned a truck simply because I loved trucks, so I found an 11000 camper in good condition and put it on my truck so I could live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living in it far longer than I ever anticipated. I originally hoped to stay in the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still live, but when I asked my parents, they said they had a full house and didn't want me there. Plus, we hadn't exactly gotten along in the past decade. They said they'd only let me park my camper there if I paid them the equivalent of what it would cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too much just to park my camper, especially since I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I found a new job. It would have been cheaper to just rent an apartment at the price they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike. My sister-in-law thought it was hilarious that I had to live in a camper, and my brother joined in, mocking me and calling me a homeless bum. The first night I had nowhere else to go, I parked my truck and camper in a store parking lot to sleep. I was terrified someone might try to break in, so I barely slept. I had nowhere else to go as the rest of my relatives lived far away, and all my friends were apartment dwellers. I was also quite attached to the area, so I didn't want to leave. I had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment since it was the only way I could still receive mail. Finding a stable place to park was difficult, so I spent months living the nomadic camper life. During that time, I dealt with everything from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding I leave because they thought my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone who claimed to be with an HOA told me to move. I wasn't even parked on a street with houses, and when I questioned which HOA they were with, they got belligerent and threatened me. I moved my camper anyway to avoid trouble. To have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know that's not the most ethical thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged to keep my refrigerator cold. I had a small solar power bank to recharge my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator, and generators are noisy and require fuel, so I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to a neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail. I'd worked retail while in college and promised myself I would never do that again, though I was nearly ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money, but I didn't have a stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to be jobless when it ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind. I had little else to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep track of where I could park and what local public bathrooms I could use. I kind of envy the fact that the Japanese have public bathhouses. We could really use something like that here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building where I worked, in old employee parking spaces that were so far in the back that they were nearly forgotten. My boss, who also owned the company, liked this arrangement because I was always available to take any shift as long as I got enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I'm not sure if this was entirely legal, but no one bothered us the entire time I lived there. I didn't have to deal with many trespassers, but the few that showed up were escorted out by the security guards. I was pretty much on call all the time and worked virtually every day of the week. My boss let me plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays when no one else was in the office except the janitor and the security guard. Beyond that, I usually showered at a friend's apartment or at my local gym, as the camper didn't have a shower and only had a portable toilet, which I didn't want to fill up because emptying it is a nasty chore. So I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could use the bathroom there at any hour. I even became good friends with the night security guard. The camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater, but summers were not fun. The camper didn't have AC, so I had to get a used portable air conditioner just to make it bearable. I made a lot of overtime pay and learned new skills from other employees. Eventually, midway through this year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted to buy a house. The scare I got from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to my work and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property just 2 miles away. I managed to get it for $10,000 less than the asking price somehow. I used nearly my entire savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to back my truck in behind the house, take the camper off, and set it up in the backyard as its own little building, just in case I wanted to use it again. When I was fully settled in the house, I was dumb enough to brag about it on social media. My family saw the post, and that's where this nightmare really starts. A few weeks later, my parents, brother, and his family came to visit, completely unannounced, to have a tour of my home. I didn't even give them my address, so I still don't know how they found out where I live. None of my friends have admitted to giving it to them, and no other family members had visited me before that, so I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home or something. It really wouldn't surprise me. When I opened the door, they practically shoved their way in, like they were on some sort of guided tour. They started making themselves at home, and Karen had this creepy smirk on her face that she kept flashing at me. It was only later that I figured out why, and it made me angrier than a bull on steroids. My parents were constantly talking about how much extra space I had now, and how it was too much for someone like me, who didn't have a wife or kids, at least not yet. My brother kept pointing out how my house was closer to his job than our parents' house. Red flags were going off all over the place. Eventually, my brother asked to speak with me privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and went out onto the front porch. That's when I realized they'd planned something. My brother, who we'll call Mike, said the house was too much for me alone, and that I should let him move in with his family because his wife was pregnant with their 4th child, and my house was much closer to his job. He pointed out that I already had the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they lived in the main house. And mind you, Mike never once mentioned paying rent. He has a good job too. He also started talking about changes and curfews and how I couldn't just walk in at any time without prior notice. If it weren't my brother, I would have thought the person I was talking to had lost their mind. But Mike lost his marbles long ago, thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way in hell I would rent my house or parts of it to him. Maybe to someone else, just to help pay off the mortgage, but certainly not to him or his nasty wife. I've heard of this exact kind of situation in videos online many times, and I never thought I'd actually live it because it seems so ludicrous. But my parents, brother, and sister-in-law all fit the bill for a bunch of narcissistic entitled crazies. So I picked up my phone, set it to record, and held on to it. Mike didn't even seem to care or notice that I was recording and just kept waving his arms around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house. Then he acted like it was a done deal and tried to shake my hand. That's when I finally found my backbone and said, "Hell no." I said it loud enough that Mike stumbled back for a second. I'd rarely raised my voice to him like that because I was punished by our parents whenever I did. But this was my house, not theirs, and my spine could be as shiny as it wanted to be here. I stood up and told him that my house was not up for grabs, and acting like I'd let him move in just because they wanted it wouldn't make it happen. I bought my house for myself, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Mike got as close to me as he could without actually touching me and said that I didn't deserve the house and that he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed in his face and said that was total nonsense because I worked hard to buy my house, so of course I deserved it. Mike started yelling that I had no wife or kids and didn't need all that space, so I may as well give it to him. I said I wasn't giving him anything, and he never even offered to pay rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in it. Then Mike said he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents said I was going to do this for him. I yelled back, as if their word is law or something, and told Mike that they didn't have the right or power to give my house to him. That's when my parents and Karen barged back in through the front door and surrounded me, trying to force me to agree. There was a lot of arguing, but to sum it up, I heard the line, "Just do it for Mike," more times than I can remember. I told them they had no say in my life or my house, and to get out before I called the cops. Karen screamed the loudest at me about how she was pregnant again and that I couldn't do this to her. I said I did nothing to her, she just assumed she could take from me, like I would just allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up princess who never had any respect for me, so I didn't care what she thought or how many kids she had. I had no sympathy for her, and she wouldn't be living in my house. Well, that made her angry enough to attack me. She got in one good hit on my face and tried to do more, but Mike held her back as she kicked and screamed, demanding that he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding recorded pretty much everything, so I held it up and said I was going to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Mike they were leaving. Then my mother said I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I wouldn't and that they shouldn't come back. Then I told Karen that my phone recorded everything, and if she tried anything, I'd press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out, crying loudly with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and said I better do this for Mike and Karen. I responded by telling her I wouldn't. Part 2. After I kicked my parents, brother, and Karen out for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately went on social media and told the story to the whole family. It spread pretty fast, but you won't find it now because it all got deleted some time ago, and I set my profile to private. I posted about it because I knew the first thing my family would do when they got home was try to twist the story to make me the villain, and I was exactly right. But I had about an hour to get started before they did, and I had video evidence to back up my story. No, I don't plan on showing the video here, so don't ask. Being proactive worked because I got a fair number of family members on my side right away. My parents, Mike, and Karen must have been set to write their own post, but it was too late, so they didn't even bother trying to lie much. They had a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not much else. Plenty of others knew how entitled they already were, so they quickly understood and accepted what had happened. There was one person in particular who called me. I don't know who they were, but they ranted at me about how I was a horrible brother and needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number. This didn't repeat. The week went by and my parents showed up with Mike on my front porch, just like they said they would in their ultimatum. They rang my doorbell like crazy and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to shove their way in again, but I'd installed a couple of latch chains that prevented it and even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down and then, in her most sickly sweet tone, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to get lost and never come back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked why I couldn't just do this for Mike, because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and bluntly said, I don't love him as a brother because he treated me like garbage for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They are terrible parents, and he is a terrible brother. I then told them to leave, or I'd call the police ASAP. They all left surprisingly easily, apart from my mother's loud crying, and the others giving me dirty looks. One could say making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week, on Friday evening, to find a moving truck and Mike's minivan parked in my driveway. They were moving stuff in. Mike just waved to me with a smug grin when I saw him. I was furious and told him and the rest of his family to stop, but Karen smugly said to me that, like it or not, they were moving in. Then, in the most fake way, while tilting her head and puckering her lips, she said it was okay because Mommy allowed it, and I should always listen to what Mommy tells me. I seethed with rage just hearing those words and looking at her smug face, so I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, Karen started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop, saying that I couldn't do this to her because she and Mike needed the house. She cried, "Why can't you just do this for Mike?" I responded with, "To hell with Mike. It's my house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard, thanks to the window being slightly open. I told Karen that if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her, and she was smart enough to retreat. When the police arrived, Mike and Karen, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I told the cops what had happened, as well as showed them my driver's license with my current address on it. When we went to the front door, I saw that they'd changed the lock, and the old lock was lying on the porch with the center of it drilled out. The drill they used was laying right next to it, along with a complete drill bit set. Could they have been any more stupid, leaving evidence out like that? I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown of all the events that had happened prior. Well, I guess Mike called our parents over at some point after I arrived home because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and said that I'd agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie, one way or another. Finally, Mike and Karen came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they'd somehow outsmarted me. They'd actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature wasn't on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them had ever actually seen my signature, so that was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Mike that this was blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure that out. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken, and I'd call CPS for good measure. Mike went white and looked really scared when I said all that. But my mother got between us and doubled down about how I should just do this for Mike and live in the camper so they could finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Mike herself and let Mike have her house instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now or I'd press charges. I stated that they drilled out my front door lock to break in. The lease papers were obvious fakes. They badly forged my signature, and I had recorded video of Karen attacking me. Those are felonies I could ruin their lives with if I wanted to. And if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Mike's kids, so they had one chance to get out. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they couldn't force me to do it for Mike. My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this. She went over to Karen and spoke with her quietly for a minute while my father spoke to Mike. Karen instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits, tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the pieces of paper or he'd cite them for littering. Both of the cops at this point had the "I don't get paid enough for this" look on their faces. Mike had to start telling his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he wouldn't get his own room now. Karen and Mike gathered their kids up to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with a sad family routine. You know, where they all gather together in a sort of group hug while all facing one direction. I swear I think they practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths. Karen kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother just made the saddest face he possibly could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter and told them to keep packing. All the kids and Karen turned the crying up to 11, and Mike yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I ended up laughing like a maniac and retorting that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing, and no amount of crying would make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled jerk who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me like when we were kids. Mike started dropping F-bombs until the cops told him to cool it, or he'd be in cuffs, regardless of whether I wanted to press charges. He sucked in his lips and looked a mix of afraid and supremely pissed off. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and Karen had all left, and they said they had no intention of going anywhere until this was resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 cops became 4, as more drove in for whatever reason. That gave my parents some extra incentive to get moving. I made Mike give me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door, though I got another lock the next day anyway because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He was really reluctant to hand them over, and instead of handing them to me, he actually threw them down the street and into a storm drain while saying to go get them myself. But one of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off just to get at them, and he got pretty dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he just grumbled and then slammed them down into my hand. I then told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, as if that were some kind of threat to me, and I voiced that to them. Then, in an overly sarcastic tone, I said something along the lines of, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any holidays with you guys, where I always get treated like crap by you all anyway, because Mike has always been your obvious favorite. You treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Mike ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So do like you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you, and suck it up." My parents were floored after I said all of that, and the quartet of cops were looking pretty judgmental at them as well. I'll tell you, if you want to put nasty parents like mine on the spot, confront them in front of cops because they'll likely not try anything really stupid then. My mother just started crying and walking away. My father just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me, and Mike just held his kids in defeat. Oh, and Karen was off having a tantrum on my front lawn. Soon enough, they all formed a line handing out boxes and got their stuff out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it was all taken out pretty quickly. But while doing it, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late, and I could still do it for Mike several times, each time trying to bargain more and more to try to make me change my mind. She said that Mike could pay me rent if I let them stay, and when that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them to let Mike rent my house, so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes because I didn't want Mike or his family around. I didn't want his money, and I certainly didn't want to live with him or my parents ever again after the way they treated me when I was a kid. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil to me. Karen ended up having another tantrum after hearing that and threw a box down, then sat on the ground to have a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She just sat there looking angry and sad until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. So before they left, I laid into my parents one last time about all the crap they put me through growing up. And with 4 cops right there, they couldn't do much other than stand there and take it for once. I called them out on so many things that happened, and even pointed out how they couldn't just do something nice for me, like letting me stay over with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. How they let Mike and Karen ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Mike could stay in it free of charge. Yet when I needed a place to go, they wanted to gouge me for more than I could afford just to park my camper when they knew I was out of a job. There were more extremely judgmental stares from the cops when I said all of that. So I put my parents on the spot one more time and asked them what I ever did other than being born to deserve being treated so badly. Because when I finally have a bit of success in life, they want to snatch it away from me for their favorite child. Since they'd rather I give everything to Mike and have nothing for myself, I bought my house using the money that I earned. I owed them nothing, and I won't be asking anything from them ever again, because clearly, I will never be anything more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no answers from them. They just stood there looking like fish out of water. So I continued ranting and asked them what in God's name made them think they were such good parents after all of that. My father was beet red, but more from embarrassment than anger this time, and my mother was crying that she was a horrible person. I bluntly agreed that she is a horrible person, they all are, and I bet they'll go to hell for it too. They were crappy people, and they all knew it. But if I called them out on all this stuff in private instead of in public, they'd just get mad at me and still act like I'm in the wrong. They just kept up the denial for so long that it became a part of who they are. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket to cry, and my father looked more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Mike and his family avoided me entirely as they finished putting everything back in the moving truck. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen, not that I'd had a chance to get much furniture yet. I was lucky to even have a couch at that time. They all got back in their vehicles, and Karen just stood staring at me with malice until Mike finally got her to drive the minivan home. And as soon as they were all gone, I got back online again and spilled the beans about what happened. My parents were too embarrassed to even try and defend their actions this time, and while the family was somewhat split before this incident, it was now a landslide in my favor. Nearly all of the family sided with me after this incident, and those who didn't simply aren't siding with anybody. No matter how much my parents tried the "we did it for Mike" line, no one listened anymore, so any remaining familial support they had is now gone. Many in the family who I expected wouldn't side with me did. That includes the former flying monkeys, so I guess they finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family for Christmas Eve at my new house. My parents were not invited. I wasn't blocked on my brother and Karen's profiles, surprisingly, and I saw that Karen had her 4th baby in early November. They're still living with my parents. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching, because Karen kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if she could still guilt me, and I'm sure it's driving my mother and father up the wall, because they aren't getting any peace and quiet in their old age, with 3 rowdy, obnoxious kids, a mentally unstable Karen, my golden child brother, and a newborn baby in the house all at once. Perhaps they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Mike take over their house completely. They might get some peace then. Yeah, they could do that for Mike. There was supposed to be more, but this post got way too long, so I'll be posting a part 3 later. Part 3. For those who commented en masse to get cameras, I will when I can afford it. I'm still in financial recovery from buying a house last year, and as far as I know, good cameras need a decent computer to record to, and I don't have anything more than a 3-year-old laptop that runs Windows 10. Yes, I'm aware of doorbell cams. That will be the first kind I get. For those who kept saying that I should have just gotten my brother and Karen arrested, the only reason I didn't was because they are parents. Their kids need them, and if Mike was arrested, he'd likely lose his job. And without that, his family has no money, and Karen has an only month-old baby right now. Neither of them needs to end up in jail. But you don't need jail for revenge. The police can help, yes, but I got payback without filing a police report. Would I be this merciful again? More than likely not, and they know it. I decided to wait on making an account and posting until after the new year just in case more stuff happened. And it did. As previous readers know, Karen was making passive-aggressive posts on social media that were obviously directed at me, especially after she had her fourth baby in November. She was posting the same repetitive nonsense over and over again. She just found semi-new ways of rewording it, but she pretty much kept regurgitating that she was tired of living with my parents, that there wasn't enough space, that she needed her own house, blah, blah, blah. I know I sound dismissive, but live through what I have with these people, and you'd be ready to sarcastically play tiny violins in front of them. Too, they're just that bad. Since I waited until January to make an account, more happened just like I thought. I stated before that I'd invited half the family for a Christmas Eve party at my house, and everyone I invited came, even though it was a fairly long drive of around 3 to 4 hours for them. But they wanted to come and show me their support. I was praised by them a lot for how hard I'd worked to get a house on my own, and that they were sorry for everything I'd gone through. I was asked why I didn't just take my camper and drive the 3 hours back to them instead of living pretty much homeless for so long, and I had to sheepishly admit that I was very attached to living around here, and that I had my best employment opportunities in this area. My hometown doesn't have a lot of great job opportunities in my field, if any at all, and I wanted to make my own way as much as I could, an answer they overall accepted. We moved on to having a rather nice party, the best I'd been to in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of great Christmas albums, and I have to say the one my uncle brought of Ray Charles was my favorite. He sings Christmas songs like no one else, I swear. It was a grand and happy time. I felt like for once I could just forget my past issues and enjoy the moment. But I wouldn't be writing this if it had stayed that way. About 2 hours into the party, you know who showed up? My parents, brother, and Karen popped in, trying to look all smiles. They didn't even knock, just walked right in my front door, like they were meant to be there. I shut off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay and said they brought gifts. One of my uncles stood up and yelled at them before I got another chance to speak, and he said they don't deserve to be in my home or my life after the crap they tried to pull months earlier. He was backed up by several other relatives. Mind you, this guy is my mother's brother, and he used to love her to pieces until he found out about the crap that went on between me and my parents. My grandparents, my mother's parents, as old as they are, hurriedly got in between us and said to my parents that if they wanted to make amends with me, it's far too soon, and they've never been more disappointed in them than they were this past year. They'd hidden their favoritism for my brother from prying eyes for a long time, but no one was fooled anymore, and they needed to make a serious effort to actually treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be in my life again. Then they turned to Mike and Karen and said, they've seen the repetitive nonsense Karen keeps posting about, they're tired of it, and to just let it go already. My house will not become their new home. Karen went back to her old standard of crying and had a pity party about how she should be the one living here and not me. She plopped down in a chair to have a tantrum and say it wasn't fair. I got this house to myself when I have no family of my own, and she has 4 kids that need more space, and she just wanted a better place to live in and feel like a real mom. It was petty of me, but I loudly pointed out that she sucks as a mother because she lets my mother do most of the parenting while she sits on her butt all day drinking, playing on her phone, or going out and spending all of Mike's money. And she has the nerve to complain about it. I even joked that I'm surprised her baby doesn't get drunk from her breast milk since she drinks so much booze, which I admit went a bit too far, as I got some stares. Karen demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom. I said the evidence speaks for itself, and if she wanted to be able to afford to move out of my parents' house someday, then she needs to put her college degree to some use, get a job, and learn to save money. My mother already does most of the childcare for my brother's kids anyway, so she'd have plenty of time after her baby gets a little older. My brother's eldest kid, who's 7 years old, ran up to start kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mom. He kept at me about how his mom said that I was the bad guy who made her cry and didn't let them live here. That's when my brother grabbed his son to pull him away, but all the other relatives jumped back in, and this sort of turned into a family intervention against Karen and my brother. She was crying, her new baby was crying, her kids were crying hell. Even Mike was very nearly in tears from the verbal lashing he was being assaulted with. He ended up just sitting on the ottoman I keep shoes in by the front door, looking like a complete wreck. He couldn't look anyone in the eye, he couldn't even say 2 words to me. Not with a whole house filled with angry people, ready to judge him if he tried to let out his inner golden child again. If they weren't there to get in his way, I'd bet this would have ended up a repeat of when he tried to order me around to take my house months earlier. By this point, though, he'd been so thoroughly humiliated that his and my parents' reputation in the family was completely destroyed because the masks were all now off. Soon after, my parents, brother, and Karen all left in defeat. The party resumed, and we all avoided speaking of what just happened for the rest of the evening. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed the night in my house. I even let some of them sleep in the camper so there'd be enough space. I admit it also makes a good guest house. My relatives all wanted a tour of it earlier as well, and they said they couldn't believe I'd been living in it for around 2 years. I got a lot of questions about it, like what summer and winter were like, and so on. I was up earlier than everyone else on Christmas morning and had a fresh pot of coffee and some ibuprofen ready for those spiked eggnog hangovers a few of them had. I was complimented on being a way nicer host than my parents ever were, and we all agreed to do this again next Christmas. After Christmas, Karen did finally stop making posts that were obvious digs at me and deleted all of the old ones as well. But shortly after the New Year, she more recently made a new post complaining about how she'd tried to convince my parents to get a camper like I did, so it could be set up in the backyard, so Mike and his family could use the whole house as their family home. Well, the taste of one's own medicine is never fun, because my parents turned that idea down vehemently. I hear no one is going to push them out of their own home, let alone their master bedroom. The post was only up for a couple of days before Karen removed it, and she has hardly posted anything since then. She loves to complain, but if a tree falls and no one is around to hear it, can it still complain? Karen, I guess, has realized there is no point in doing it when no one hears her anymore, and Mike can't afford to move his family out on his salary alone anytime soon. If they end up expecting another child in the next few years, I won't be surprised. Things have mellowed down for me since then, and I've even invited friends over for a poker night. I suck at poker because I can never remember a damn thing about it. But so what? We get to drink beer and eat junk food while being merry idiots. We all loaded up on burgers from a fast food joint and just had it the best way grown men can when they just want to have a good, unadulterated time and get pissed drunk. I think maybe around summer, I'll look into possibly dating someone. I'm not exactly getting any younger here. Fingers crossed that goes well. My camper just sits idle in my yard now. And I admit there were some days I went out there just to spend time in it. I did live in it for 2 years. It's like my second home. And maybe one day I'll actually get to use it for camping like it was meant to be. I've never been camping. My parents considered it a waste of time, so it would be a completely new experience for me. This pretty much marks the end of what happened. My parents, brother, and Karen have all been staying very clear of me. In fact, they seem to have gone back to acting like I don't exist, like they did before I bought a house. Not like that bothers me at all, it's better that way. But they'll inevitably come back in some way. I know they will. I just wonder what kind of stupid thing they'll do next. If anything notable like all this ever happens again, I'll make another post if this account is still active. Update. This will not surprise some people who commented on my previous posts because my parents did some of the exact things they said they would, which was wanting either my money or my signature. I did expect the classic lines of narcissists saying that I owed them or giving me some kind of socialist BS about sharing the wealth, but that was just my imagination running wild. The ensuing situation was somewhat similar to that, but much more tame. I guess you could say they seemed to know not to push me too far now and were mostly aiming for pity. It began when my parents recently got in touch with me through social media and asked for a meeting in a public place of my choosing. It just screamed trap, but I wasn't afraid. In fact, I was amused. They know I'm not to be messed with anymore, so I could only wonder what they wanted this time. I picked a local restaurant that may have a name of an olive and a garden in it, and we met up there. Mike was with them, but he kept his mouth shut most of the time. We had awkward greetings, ordered some drinks, and then cut to the chase. My parents begged me to help Mike get his own apartment so he could finally move out. Apparently, Mike's credit isn't so great, G. I wonder why. Could it be his wife regularly spends him into a hole? Well, they asked that I help by either supplying some capital or by co-signing for the apartment and helping to pay the rent for it. I simply said no to both. That's when Mike spoke up in anger and yelled at me that I have so much and I don't have a family to support like he does. He needed my help, and I should be sparing the money for his family since I don't have one myself. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed their help. Oh, that's right. They were pointing and laughing at me for being homeless. Or should we go further back to my childhood? I'd love to delve into that with plenty of ears to listen around us. My mother grabbed my hand and begged me not to speak of any of it. My father and Mike both just looked away and said nothing. I'm pretty sure they wanted to say something like they used to at me but held their tongues. I asked them if they thought I was rich or something, and their look said it all. When I told them I don't have that kind of money, they looked at me like deer in headlights. I broke it down about how much I'd managed to save for the down payment on my house, and the way I had to live and work in order to save that much so fast, and then how I spent nearly all of it on the down payment of my house. I'm still in financial recovery. I did have monthly income to spare, yes, but most of it was going right into my savings. I asked Mike what his yearly salary was, and when he told me, I pointed out that it was actually a bit higher than mine. I then loosely broke things down in rough math in front of my parents, about how about 70 of my income goes to my mortgage, insurance, gasoline, internet, phone, food, and other bills. And then there's maybe 30 of that left at most that I can put into savings. And I need that money saved to get back on my feet in time, and I have to make sure I have savings to fall back on. My truck is from the 90s if it were to break down. I'd need money to either fix or replace it. And there are other things one would need a rainy day fund for, like home repairs, taxes, lawyers, or anything in general you'd need quick cash for when it's a sudden unexpected expense. So, as you can see, I just can't spare money for Mike, and I also refuse to co-sign for anything, as that would leave me on the hook for any bill Mike couldn't or wouldn't pay. Then I pointed out that that's likely why my parents didn't co-sign for Mike's apartment themselves long ago. My mother just started crying again. I was pretty much one step ahead of them in all of this. I'm not an ATM and I'm not a fool, and I stated that right to their faces. I expected my father to become angry with me like he always does, but this time he just, well, didn't. I've known this man to explode on me for the slightest provocation of not enabling my brother all my life, but this time he just didn't do that. There wasn't even a sneer on his face. The only way I could describe the look he had was regret and defeat. Maybe regret for being a crappy parent, or maybe regret because he can't bully me around anymore, who knows. Either way, my parents couldn't really argue with me, and I wasn't about to give them any money. Mike just got up and said this was all just a waste of their time and that he was leaving. My mother started apologizing for him, but Mike still wanted to leave. Then, just to kill with kindness, I offered to buy them a round of unlimited soup and salad while we were all there. I guess they couldn't turn down free food since we hadn't ordered anything but drinks yet, and they stayed. I went out of my way to talk about anything other than money. Mike remained quiet and was either eating his food or looking at his phone, but my parents just awkwardly talked with me. They brought up that they've recently joined a local Christian church and that they'd already been going for the last 2 weeks. I said good for them, and they, of course, started trying to advertise that they'd like me to go too. I simply said no thanks, and they were smart enough not to push further. When the meal was finished, Mike left 10 on the table for the tip and walked off without saying another word to me or anyone. My mother just excused his behavior, and we all parted ways. That was about it, not nearly as much drama as I thought there'd be, but this is still far better than how things used to be with my parents and brother. As for Karen, while she's been regularly complaining online about my parents, she really doesn't seem to like the fact that she's not the queen bee of their house, and I think her toxic attitude is finally getting to them. Why else would they be so desperate to come crawling back to me? Karen actually wants my parents to move into a camper like I had to do in order to make space in the house, and she's being told no every time. She does seem to have a following of like-minded people, though, because here and there I get messages from someone I don't know who's intent on raging at me for not giving up my house for Karen. I don't bother arguing with these people anymore. I just block and move on. Though there was one persistent troll who had my phone number, and they'd call from a different number every time. Yes, it seems to be the same person who called me to say I need to make way for a real family man like Mike, but I could care less. The calls, though, seem to have slowed down, if not maybe stopped, because I made it clear to that person that they were only amusing me by keeping this up for so long. The last time they called was around the beginning of the month, and it's been silence from them since then.